in just a few minutes. But first off, I just want you to be aware of how you should be approaching these questions. So it's a two-step process, and we'll look at both of these steps in detail. But the first thing you want to do is analyze the charts and plan how to group the information. Now, we're going to group the information into two main groups. I'll talk about this when we look at the outline. But the most important thing is not to get flustered with the amount of information that you're going to see. You're going to see a lot of pie charts, you're going to see a lot of percentages perhaps, and a lot of information. And this is actually more than what you would expect with just two pie charts or just one pie chart, for example. So you're really going to have to do your best to analyze the charts, and it might not be as easy as you think, or it might not be as obvious. So I'm going to show you how to do that in our example. Once we do that and we take our notes and we make a little outline, we are going to approach step 2, which is writing an essay using the recommended essay structure. And the essay structure is something that you can use for pretty much any writing task 1 for the IELTS academic exam. So this is nothing new. We just have to make sure we're being concise and coherent. So I'll take you through that as well. Now, before we get into our first example for today, I just want to take you through a guide for our step 1. So we do have 2 general steps, but step 1 can actually be broken up into 2 parts, and that is A and B. So like we looked at from the previous slide, we're going to analyze the charts and plan how to group the information. And in order to do this efficiently and effectively, we want to organize the information into 2 categories. When we're looking at multiple pie charts, it is sometimes confusing and a little bit time-consuming to understand how to make these 2 categories. So I will walk you through that today. And then secondly, we're going to describe the key information from each of the 2 categories. It's very important that we do not discuss each and every piece of information from all of the pie charts. That is a pitfall and a difficult component of this type of question. So we're only going to be looking at the key information. Okay, let's get started with our first example, and we're going to focus on step 1. Okay, and here is our first example for today. So I'm going to take you through the language and the writing prompt, and then we will get started and we will analyze our charts. So first off, it says, the charts below give information on the ages of the populations of Yemen and Italy in 2000 and projections for 2050. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Write at least 150 words. So this is a very standard writing prompt. And the most important thing, the thing I really want to call your attention to, is that we will have to make comparisons where relevant. A big problem with this type of question with more than 2 pie charts is that students usually just discuss every single piece of information in each pie chart without comparing. Remember, we have to write 150 words. When it comes to questions like this, you're probably going to write more than 150. So you want to stay around 200 words if you find yourself writing a lot more than 150. You don't want to go too far over 200. A little bit is okay. It depends. It's a case-by-case situation sometimes. You'll see today we'll probably write around 200 just because there is so much to say, especially when you want to make comparisons. If you find yourself going too far over 200, like 220, that is too much. So something that you have to practice with this question type is really being concise and understanding what the main features are. So you do not want to write everything, and we don't want to write every single piece of information here. So that's really the main thing. Make sure you are comparing and do not get carried away with analyzing the information. So with that being said, we're going to look at this example, really study these charts. And you see, we are given 4 pie charts, 2 that correspond to Yemen and 2 that correspond to Italy. It's also important to note that we have 2 that correspond to the year 2000 and 2 that correspond to the year 2050. So you might think that you have a choice here. You could either group the information based on Yemen in one category and the information of Italy in the other category, or you could group the information in the year 2000 and then in the year 2050. Now I'm going to show you which one is actually better, and I'll explain why. So think about how we can combine the information. It's actually best if you combine the information based on the years. So you want to have one group that is 2000 and one group that is 2050. This is because we're going to describe and compare Italy and Yemen's population data from the year 2000, so these two pie charts on the left, and then we're going to compare Yemen and Italy for the year 2050. So this will allow us to compare data from both Italy and Yemen, while also comparing the data from both years. If we were to group Yemen in one category and Italy in the other, you'd have to spend time comparing 2000 and 2050, and then also comparing Yemen and Italy, and that is just far too much information to include for a 150-word minimum. So I'll take you through it, I'll show you why, but in cases like this, it's usually best to group the years and use those as the significant features rather than the countries. Now right here below, you'll see step 1. It is analyze the pie charts and describe key information. So like we just said, our body paragraph 1 is actually going to be based on data from the year 2000, and our body paragraph 2 is going to be based on data from 2050. This will allow us to effectively compare Yemen and Italy and compare the years 2000 and 2050, and we're going to do this in a concise manner without writing too much and taking up too much time. So basically what I'm going to do here is take notes in the form of a table, and this will really help you organize your thoughts, and you can also find comparisons to write about in your essay, which is extremely important and something that students forget to do. Also remember, you do not have to use proper grammar or vocabulary here. Feel free to use abbreviations as long as it makes sense to you and it allows you to do it quickly. Examiners are not going to be looking at this note-taking part. So I'll just give us some more room here. And basically, I'm going to start at 2000. I'm going to start with Yemen. So we're looking at this pie chart on the upper left-hand corner. And I'm just going to write a Y to save on space. And right away, I see that just over half, so 50.10%, is in the 0 to 14 years category. This is very important. It's very specific, and I'm going to write half of population in 0 to 14 group. Then I see that senior citizens actually made up less than 5% of this group. It's 3.60. And we don't have to be so specific when talking about numbers here. We could definitely say less than 5% because 5% is a good benchmark. So I'm going to say senior citizens, SC, makes up less than 5%. And then we see the 15 to 59 age group is slightly half of population, okay, because we see it as 46.30. Now, right away, I'm going to go into Italy. Now we're looking at the bottom left-hand corner, this pie chart here, because remember, we're looking at 2000. So for Italy, I see quite a change. If we're looking at the blue area, that is 0 to 14 years, we have only 14.30%. That's the smallest group here. So I definitely want to talk about that. And I'm going to say 14% in the 0 to 14 group. And here, quite distinctively, the 15 to 59-year-old age group is the largest group. So I definitely want to make note of that. So I say the largest group is aged 15 to 59 years old. And then we have, again, our senior citizens in gray, and that is anyone over 60 years old. We see that the senior citizens made up around a quarter. So we have just about a quarter. A quarter would be 25%. This here is 24.10, so we can say approximately a quarter of the population. So notice that I have said half in a fraction. I'm talking about quarters, but I'm writing 1/4. You really need to be aware of the different ways you can talk about percentages. We'll look at all of the language when I actually write the essay, but just start thinking about this now, and it's also very important as you're studying and preparing for the exam. So that is really all I want to do when it comes to the year 2000. Now we're going to do the same thing when looking at 2050. Here I'm going to be looking at Yemen on the upper right-hand side. So again, I'm just going to write a Y for consistency, and I'm going to talk about what is relevant in this pie chart. And what I see is that the age group from 0 to 14 in blue, that is going to decline. So this is a forecast, so we're going to use the future tense. And I'm going to say here that 0 to 14 will decline to 37%. When it comes to our senior citizens over 60 years old, it looks like that will increase about 2%. And then we see the group 15 to 59, that will actually grow. So I am just going to say group 15 to 59 will grow. And that here is sufficient. Now we're going to go back to Italy, looking at 2050. That is the lower right-hand pie chart. And we'll look at the differences here. So we're actually going to be comparing 2000 and 2050 as well. So in Italy, it looks like the age group 0 to 14 is going to have a 3% drop. So I'll say 0 to 14, 3% drop. We also see senior citizens almost doubling. So we have 24.10% and then 42.30%. That's almost double. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. I'm going to say senior citizens will almost double. And then our group 15 to 59, that is also quite interesting. It's going to be reduced by almost 2/3. And so it is a little bit helpful to keep your math in mind, just so that you're able to talk about fractions and percentages. So we're going from 61.60 to 46.20. And that is our first step. You just want to pull out your key information and understand which option will allow you to best define and compare as much as possible. In this case, we are looking at the dates because we can compare Yemen and Italy in each paragraph, and we can also effectively compare the data between 2000 and 2050. So we are comparing everything. There is really no chance that we're just going to be writing this information and just defining everything without comparison. That is definitely not an option with this structure. Again, I hope you can see it after this outline. If we were to just have a body paragraph 1 about Yemen and a body paragraph 2 about Italy, we would have to describe and compare data from 2000 and 2050 in the paragraph for Yemen, and we would also have to compare Yemen and Italy. Since we have more years than countries, it is a nice clue that the years should be the significant features that you use to group your information. That's always a great idea. Okay, now that we've done step 1, I'm going to take you back to review the step 2 overall trend and the outline that we're going to use to write this, and then we'll come back here to write our essay. Now, we're going to go back to our guide, and we're going to focus on a step that we're going to approach before we actually write the essay. And you can consider this still as part of step 1. What you're going to do briefly is summarize the overall trend. And there are 2 steps here. Basically, when we go back to our writing prompt, we're going to look at those pie charts, and we're going to check to see if there is one category that is higher or lower overall. And then if it applies, we can find trends with huge value differences or little differences. And this is going to be important when we compare the years in this case, and also the countries, Italy and Yemen. So keep these 2 general steps in mind. We always want to look at something that is a huge value difference or a little value difference, just because that is going to be a specific detail. We don't really want to spend too much time on something that is mid-range or not very interesting. Now, with that in mind, we are going to focus on the paragraphs and the outline of our essay. We're going to do this in just a few minutes, and you can think of your outline just like this. We're going to have an introduction, and in the introduction, we're going to paraphrase the task question. So that means basically restating the question using different words and synonyms. Then we're going to have this overview paragraph, which is exactly what we just talked about. We're going to describe the overall trend of the charts. And then, quite simply, our last two paragraphs are going to be writing about the first significant feature and then the second significant feature. Now, for the outline we just looked at in our first example, that is going to be the year 2000 in the first paragraph and the year 2050 in the second paragraph. This outline is foolproof. I definitely suggest that you use it because you're going to get in all the relevant information while sticking to a great flow and organization. And speaking of that, before we write the essay, I just want to briefly discuss the scoring. So you're going to be scored on 4 components. The first one is task achievement. This is basically looking at whether or not you have answered the question well. And that is why comparing is so important for questions with multiple pie charts. Again, like I said, most students will just list off key features and they will not compare the relevant data. That is where task achievement comes in. So make sure you are fully answering your question. Second, coherence and cohesion is basically all about the outline that I just showed you. You want to make sure that your essay is flowing logically, that you don't start with body paragraph 1 and then paraphrase your task question at the end. Don't do that. Follow that foolproof outline. I'll show you how to use it in just a bit. And the last 2 are lexical resource and grammatical range and accuracy. Here, this is all about the language and the grammar that you use. I will take you through the lexical resource just to make sure that you are using synonyms and advanced level vocabulary, and also the grammar. So keep in mind whether or not you have dates in the future or dates in the past. This will impact the grammar that you use. You'll see in our first example, we're going to be using the future. So whenever you can make something a bit more advanced when it comes to your grammar, definitely do that. It will help you with the scoring. All right, so let's go back. I'll look at the overall trend with you, and then we will go ahead and start writing our essay. Okay, so we're back, and we have, of course, our 4 pie charts on the left, and I've added this overview overall trend to make some notes. Now, let's just take a look at these pie charts. First off, it is clear that both countries are going to experience changes in terms of the age groups and the trends. This we've already talked about in our notes, and I want you to notice, however, the age group of 60 plus years. Now, that is the gray. Now, I want you to notice that, and you'll see that there are increases from 2000 to 2050 in both Yemen and Italy. And that is something that is true in all cases. This is definitely a trend because the percentage is going to become higher overall for the senior citizens. So let's make a note of that. I'm just going to write increase in people over 60, and I'll put both, and that means for both countries. And another thing I want to look at is 0 to 14 years. Now that is the blue. So you see how in Yemen, it starts at 50.10%, but then it decreases to 37%. And the same thing in Italy. It starts at 14.30 in 2000 and decreases in 2050 to 11.50. So I'm going to say a decrease in people 0 to 14 years, and of course I'll put both. Notice that we are not talking about 15 to 59-year-olds in our overview paragraph. That's because in Yemen, it increases, but in Italy, it decreases. This is not an overall trend that is true in all cases. So we're just going to save that for our body paragraphs 1 and 2. Remember, just look at things that are true in both of these cases. They are significant features because they increase and decrease, and that is a perfect overview. Okay, so now we're going to start writing. I have added these headings just for you, just so you can see how I'm spacing out the essay. Of course, when you write your essay, you do not want to include these headings. Now I'm going to write it with you. However, we will examine the language and the grammar, any synonyms at the end, and we'll look at it together. So remember, for our introduction, we are just going to paraphrase the task question. So I'm just going to scroll up here, and remember, we see the charts below give information on the ages of the populations of Yemen and Italy in 2000 and projections for 2050. This is what we want to paraphrase. So I'm going to start off and say the pie charts represent population data based on age in Yemen and Italy in 2000, along with future predictions for 2050. And remember, I have just changed some things. So I've said pie charts instead of just charts. Instead of give information, I've said represent. And then population data based on age is different than the ages of the populations. So I've added the fact that it's data, and I've just said based on age instead of on the ages. I've kept, of course, Yemen and Italy in 2000, and I said future predictions instead of projections. So we're done with that. It's short and sweet. You just want to paraphrase and not do anything too out of the ordinary. Now we have our overview paragraph, and we're going to use these notes right here just to make a general statement about trends. So I'm going to say, overall, changes in proportions of age groups are expected in both countries, including an increase in the percentage of people over 60 years old and a decrease in those aged 0 to 14 by 2050. And again, that is exactly what we looked at in our notes here. So we're finished with that as well. Remember, you want to keep it short and sweet. Now we're going into body paragraph 1. So we want to talk about this data here. We made notes on it earlier. So I'm just going to start by saying that we're talking about 2000, the year 2000. So I'll say in 2000, those in the 0 to 14 years age group constituted roughly half of Yemen's total population. So remember, this is what we were talking about here. Now I'm going to directly compare that to Italy. This is very important. So I'm going to say, while only 14% of Italian citizens were included in this category. So we have included relevant information while also comparing Yemen and Italy. Now it's time to look at our senior citizen group. So I'm just following my notes here, and I'm going to say senior citizens made up less than 5% of Yemen's total population, in contrast to approximately a quarter of the Italian population. Remember, we looked at that right here. I said 1/4 in my notes, and I've chosen to say a quarter in my body paragraph. Again, we'll talk about the language choices after. Now we're going to talk about the last group, and that's citizens aged 15 to 59 years old, represented Italy's largest group at just over 60%, whereas this group represented slightly below half of Yemen's inhabitants. So notice how I'm changing up some words, I'm using synonyms, and again, I'm just using the notes that I made earlier when analyzing the pie charts in the beginning. And that is all we have for our body paragraph 1. It is simple, to the point, but also makes necessary comparisons. And now for the last paragraph, we're going to focus on 2050. So quite simply, I'm going to say in 2050, it is predicted that the percentage of the population aged below 14 years old will decline to 37% in Yemen. That is exactly what we saw here. Now, again, we want to just compare it to Italy. So I'm going to connect these ideas and say, compared to only a 3% drop in Italy. Now, again, senior citizens, it's like following a formula. While senior citizens are expected to almost double in Italy, they are likely to increase by a mere 2% in Yemen. Although the group of people aged 15 to 59 is expected to grow in Yemen, just like we saw here, I'm going to talk about how it's going to be reduced. So I'm going to say it will be reduced by almost 2/3 in Italy. And there you have it. We have followed our notes. It is very organized. We have all of our information that is relevant. We have our comparisons, and we are finished with this essay. Now I'm going to clean it up a little bit and show you the language and the word count. Now you see I've color-coded the synonyms and topic vocabulary in blue, useful vocabulary and phrases in green, and important functional words in red. You'll also see that the total word count is 213 words. That's not bad. It is definitely at our minimum of 150, but it doesn't go extremely overboard. So I would say that this is probably the maximum 215, 220. You don't want to go any more over that. But keep in mind, this was quite complicated. We had a lot to talk about and a lot to compare. So this is completely normal. Again, like I said earlier, this question type will usually involve more words. The most important thing is being concise, which we were able to do. Now let's take a look at our synonyms and topic vocabulary in blue. Here I have population data like we talked about before and future predictions instead of projections. Then we have changes in proportions. Proportions is a great word when talking about pie charts and percentages. Total population. Citizens is a great word in this case. We're talking about people in countries. So citizens is great. Senior citizens is an excellent term, and it is very applicable in this case for those over 60 years old. And of course, inhabitants is another way to say people who live in a certain area. These are specific to the topic at hand. If you are studying the topics of IELTS, this should be second nature. Always make sure you are studying your synonyms. Now for useful vocabulary and phrases, this is for writing task 1 in general. Now I want you to note that we used the passive voice here. That is the best route to go when it comes to writing task 1 usually. So we're looking at are expected, for example. If we look at the last paragraph, we see it is predicted that. So in this case, we don't really know who is predicting the information, and it isn't important. So using the passive will really help here. Let's go back to our overview paragraph. We see an increase in, this is great basic terminology, constituted roughly half of, this is another way to say made up. So you don't always want to say that it is. Constituted and made up, these are great things. Roughly half is an excellent way to say almost half without using approximately or almost too much. Roughly is a great synonym there. We see made up less than, approximately a quarter of, and represented. Then in our last paragraph, like I said earlier, it is predicted. Then we see the active. So it will decline to. Drop is a great way to talk about a decline. Almost double. So notice how I used approximately, roughly. Here I went ahead and used almost. And then they are likely to increase. This is likely because it's just a projection. It is not a definite future occurrence. And then by a mere, that just shows that it's very small, a minute 2%. So I'm just drawing attention here that it's only 2%. Then we see expected to grow. It will be reduced by almost 2/3. So note how I've used a mix of passive and active, but pretty much the overall grammar point that you want to use for writing task 1 is most likely going to be the passive. Lastly, let's look at our red, our functional words that really tie everything together. Here, this is quite simple. In our overview paragraph, we have overall. We could also say in general. This is just drawing attention to the overall grand scheme of things. And then to be specific, we say in 2000 and in 2050. Very simple. The thing you should be paying attention to here is the connectives. So we see while, in contrast to, and whereas. These are great ways to compare while saving on word count and also tying into things together without having to make two separate sentences. So I was able to compare in that way. Same thing in our last paragraph, compared to, while, and although. Great ways to show contrasting arguments. All right, great job here. We're going to take things up a notch and move a little bit quicker in our second example. So let's look at that now. And here we are. It says, the charts below show the percentage of water used for different purposes in 6 areas of the world. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Write at least 150 words. Now you might be thinking, wow, there are 6 pie charts here. There's a lot of information, but you basically want to use the same ideas and the same organization methods that we used in our first example. It is different, but it is not that strange. So again, here we see our 6 areas of the world. We see industrial use, agricultural use, and domestic use. And the thing that should be jumping out at you is agricultural use. Notice how in these last 3 bottom areas, it is the absolute highest amount, also for South America. And we also have a nice chunk, a nice percentage of agricultural use in North America and Europe. So I want you to think of this sort of as the lone wolf in that it is the biggest use of the 3. And we see domestic use and industrial use as smaller percentages in the bottom 3, also smaller for South America, not quite the same for North America and Europe, but in general, a majority of these 6 areas use domestic use and industrial use less. And so this will give us a clue as to how we should be analyzing the charts and using our significant features. Okay, and I've done that for you right here on the right-hand side. So I've separated industrial and domestic into body paragraph 1. I've grouped the 2 smaller together. And then body paragraph 2 will talk all about agricultural use. So for body paragraph 1, we are simply going to separate industrial and domestic in a very organized manner. So when looking at industrial use, we see that North America and Europe consume approximately 50% of water on average for this reason. I've basically gone ahead and taken the average of 48 and 53. It's more or less 50%. Remember, you want to use this benchmark of 50 and also state that it is on average. That's all we really need to say. Then for domestic use, it is clear that South America uses nearly 20%, and it's the highest of all the regions. So we definitely want to talk about that. And then you can also mention that North America's consumption is slightly lower than Europe. We have 13 and 15%. And that's it. These are the main features. Now, if we go to agricultural, this is going to be short and sweet, really, because we see that South America, Africa, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia have the highest water consumption based on agricultural use. And that is the most significant feature. Now, in our essay, I'm going to talk about percentages and we'll talk about numbers and I'll show you that where it's relevant. But this is the main idea. These are the main points that you want to talk about and compare in your essay. Of course, we do have to talk about the overview. And for the overview, remember, we're looking at significant, highest, and lowest. And basically what we see is that industrial use is highest in North America and Europe. So I'm going to put IU, highest in North America and Europe. And then we see agricultural use is highest in the other 4 regions. This is the most prominent general information included in the pie charts, and we do not have to include anything else in our overview because it's not as general of a trend as these 2 features right here. Okay, so this is the preparation work. Now I'm going to show you the color-coded essay and we'll read it together. Okay, and here we are. So we've got our color-coded essay. I'm going to start with the introduction that's been paraphrased. It says, the pie charts provide information regarding the proportions of water used for industrial, agricultural, and domestic use in 6 regions. Now, I've said proportions of water rather than percentage of water, and we see industrial, agricultural, domestic. I've taken that right from the key here, even though it wasn't in our prompt. That's fine. And instead of saying 6 areas of the world, I've said 6 regions. Now, looking at the overview paragraph, I've said in general, water serves mostly an industrial purpose in North America and Europe, whereas it is predominantly used for agriculture in South America, Africa, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. So note I'm being general, so I've said in general, and whereas, like we saw in our previous example, is a great connective. I've also said mostly and predominantly. I've included this in green. Mostly is because it's at 48%. Predominantly is something that is a main feature. Now looking at body paragraph 1, it says, regarding industrial and domestic use, North America and Europe consume an average of approximately 50% of water for industrial purposes. However, these 2 regions report much less water consumption for domestic purposes, utilizing 13% and 15% respectively. And respectively is a great term. I've put it here in green because we're talking about North America and Europe. We don't have to repeat those words. So I know that 13% pertains to North America and 15 to Europe, just like we looked at here. Then I continue on and I say, out of all 6 regions, South America dedicates the highest percentage of water consumption for domestic use, but uses only 10% for industrial reasons. Both industrial and domestic use remain the least popular choices in Africa, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia, where their combined use makes up less than 20% of the overall water consumption in each of the 3 regions. And so I haven't gone too much in detail, but I just wanted to say that it is the least popular for these 3 areas. And I'm looking at the combined use. So basically I've looked at these 2 numbers, these 2 numbers, and these 2 numbers for each of these areas and notice that they are less than 20%. Again, you want to use these benchmark round whole numbers when possible. Now you'll notice that agricultural use is shorter than our body paragraph 1, but that makes sense and it's fine. We were talking about 2 points in body paragraph 1, so obviously there was more to write. Agricultural will be a bit smaller. So I see agricultural use, on the other hand, accounts for 71% of water consumption in South America and over 3/4 of water use in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia, where it is nearly 90%. And I'm looking at Central Asia specifically. I want to make a note that it's nearly 90%. We're at 88% here. And then North America and Europe consume less than 40% of water for agricultural purposes. And that is exactly what we saw. So note that in my notes, I gave myself a guideline. And as I was writing, I looked and analyzed the pie charts for specific information like what we see here, less than 40%, or makes up less than 20%. You don't have to write all of these specific percentages in your notes. You can just give yourself sort of a map and then elaborate as you are writing it. And then just to see here, we have some nice important functional words in red. Regarding, on the other hand, these are great ways to start your body paragraphs. And of course, however, is a contrasting word to highlight a contrasting idea. Pay close attention to these vocabulary and phrases in green. Accounts for is a great way to say makes up. I said over 3/4 instead of saying over 75%. Combined use, this is excellent when we have more than 2 pie charts because we're actually looking at the combined percentages, and this is a nice way to compare and contrast ideas. I also see out of all 6 regions. So when you want to pay attention to something in particular, you can say out of all 6 regions, or perhaps if you only had 4, You could say out of all 4. It really depends on how much you have. Great job today. This was a lot to take in, and like I said, more than 2 pie charts can really get confusing. So thanks for following along. Let's wrap up this lesson and just look at some do's and don'ts. First off, things you want to do: definitely analyze your charts before writing. A little bit more time will have to be devoted to analyzing the charts because you're going to have more than 2. So make sure you are finding the main features so that you are able to compare the information and the features. Notice in the first example, I spent some more time with you writing out and looking at these features. In the second essay, I sort of just gave you a map, and then we embellished on it when actually writing the essay. So don't feel like you have to write every feature in your notes. Really find a note-taking system that works for you. Then you want to, of course, implement proper grammar. We used a lot of passive, and then organize your essay using that foolproof method. Things you don't want to do: definitely don't start writing the essay immediately without even analyzing your charts. You do need to spend a couple of minutes on the analysis process. Of course, today I took my time with you. With time and practice, you'll be able to minimize the time it takes and be very efficient in your analysis. Do not write about each and every element in your pie chart. Now, you do want to touch upon each pie chart in some way, but do not write an in-depth analysis on every single point in every single pie chart. And of course, you don't want to forget to look at the major trends and information. That overview paragraph is very important. And of course, don't use incorrect grammar. Really study up on the difference between the passive and the active, and a